this conference is of very great importance to us as a Kenya Film Classification Board, because as a regulatory agency in the film and I would say the broadcast sector, issues being discussed on culture, on media and communications, which to a great extent affect cultures, is of great interest to us, because we know how communication and media, be it content, affects the culture. And again, when we are talking of the China and African culture in this context, allow me shortly to say that our mandate as a Kenya Film Classification Board is to regulate film content in 3 levels. That is at the creation level, at exhibition level, and its distribution level. And how we regulate is that when a film or broadcast content is supposed to go on air or to be distributed, it's submitted to the board for examination and classification, so that we are able to advise on age suitability and on watershed period, that is the safe harbor that we operate in Kenya and which operates in the world over. Allow me also to say that we know that China has interest in that sector, the film and also in the broadcast. We have a number of stations like the China Radio International, we have CCTV and others. And so that's why I'm saying that this conference, I've come to learn. I think it's a learning experience for me, since I've not been to this conference before. I want to learn from the participants and the audience and even the panelists who are with me about how that integration of Kenya and China and the interests the two countries have in the industry, how this is going to make us work even better and for synergy and all that. So actually, I would say that is the reason that Kenya Film Classification Board sponsored this event, because we thought it was of key interest. And actually also we are very interested in the research that comes with such conferences on what can we borrow from China or from other African countries when it comes to content regulation, so that we don't feel like we are inhibiting growth or we are affecting the ease of doing business in Kenya, because we want to be part of the knowledge economy, and in a way that we make the industry more facilitative for ease of doing business in that industry. So I think that's just my quick remarks. I'll be getting more questions from the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emmah. And now I'd like to invite Winslow Robertson, who is a China-Africa consultant based in the US. I think most of us are familiar with his work with a podcast, a popular one called Cowries and Rice. Winslow, welcome, and give us your perspectives on this.
Thank you so very much for attending, and I know my name was not on the program, but I promise to make it worth your while. In any case, I'm going to discuss, but I'm going to defend the US and British media and how they cover China-Africa relations. I'm not going to talk about the West writ large, because I don't know, I don't read French newspapers, I don't read German newspapers. And I'm going to start out by mentioning a man by the name of Donald Trump. So, yeah, you can vote and hiss, I'm okay with that. So Donald Trump, when he was starting his rise in terms of American Republican politics, kept mentioning the polls. The polls said he was doing well, the polls were great. Now, Donald Trump, not doing so well in presidential polls. What's he say? The polls are rigged, the polls are wrong, the polls are faulty. The language that we use in terms of China-Africa perceptions of media regarding China-Africa relations sometimes there's words we use that go beyond good or bad. We're talking about biased, unbiased, or even the term constructive. And in that sort of language, I hear echoes of Donald Trump. I would argue for a lot of folks, when China-Africa stories are good or positive, that's good objective reporting. When China-Africa stories are not so good, that's not objective reporting. I think it's actually a little more complicated than that, because American journalists, British journalists, a lot of those journalists don't have a background in China or in Africa to report in a way I consider all that good. Not to say that all journalists are like that. There's a journalist in Quartz named Lily Kuo, who is a fantastic, phenomenal journalist, and I urge all of you to look her up. And she has China background and she has an Africa background. There are a lot of really good journalists who will spend time on the ground, who will report, who will try to get access, who will do everything, at least in the US, every journalist should do. But even after that, maybe an editor might not like it. Why? An editor might not have the background to know a good China-Africa story or fact from one that's not so good. And one thing I was quite embarrassed to see in terms of American coverage was the Zimbabwe cannibalism story. I think a lot of you are familiar with, where in Zimbabwean social media there was a story of cannibalism, I think in Shanghai, and that was brought to Zimbabwe, and then American newspapers and media outlets picked it up. No editor should have found that to be a story. And anyone who says, American media is bad for that, they're right in that particular regards. But there's a lot of actually really good China-Africa reporting done by media outlets, by people who work hard and who try hard. And I think that when we focus on biased, unbiased, we're focusing perhaps on the wrong thing. And also, the call for African media outlets to tell the story is a good call. I want to read more African journalists shaping this story, and not just from American outlets. I want to read more of these great stories from The Standard or The Daily Nation. And I do. Professionally, I have to read local media for this. But that doesn't mean the Wall Street Journal is trash. That doesn't mean China Daily is trash. China Daily sometimes writes stuff with a bent that I don't always agree with, but you know what? Sometimes they write stories that are really good and really well reported. And I think that in terms of what we can do as journalists or academics or scholars, and especially as consumers, is we can demand better coverage, or we can create the stories ourselves. I wish the Washington Post was better, but that doesn't mean they're bad. And it doesn't mean they're not worth reading. And I urge all of you to pull back a little bit and think about, as scholars, where the analysis lies, where the research lies. In terms of media relations, that critical facility is really important. But be careful about throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Just because it's the New York Times doesn't mean it's nefarious or despicable. And I'm not saying everyone believes that way. But, I cut a lot of slack to journalists from Xinhua or from China Daily. Will they report on everything I want them to report on China? No, not particularly. But CCTV pays African journalists. I like that. I wish CNN did that. CNN doesn't. Okay, that's fine. But that doesn't always mean CNN is a terrible organization. It can be quite bad, and I freely admit that. But I urge all of us to have these complexities in the back of our mind in terms of media. If media just serves to reinforce our beliefs, then media has no purpose at all. And that's my conclusion.
Thanks, Winslow. Very interesting perspectives. I'm sure you are keeping your questions. We'll have some very vibrant discussion after this. Now to invite Mr. Henry Makori. He's the editor of Pambazuka News, which quite a number of us, I'm sure, are familiar with. Pambazuka News is part of Fahamu. So Henry, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Bob. And good afternoon, my brothers and sisters.
Good afternoon.
As Bob has said, I work for Fahamu as editor with Pambazuka News. And a lot of what I'm going to say here, I think, has been said by previous speakers, and particularly the keynote speaker for this afternoon, Professor Shege of the University of Nairobi. The role of media in China-Africa relations, I think I'm taking a perspective of civil society, which is what we do. One foot in media, another foot in civil society. China in Africa is a subject that has for several years now engaged the minds of many contributors to our weekly online magazine, Pambazuka News. Media, as I read it generally, the coverage in Africa of China in Africa tends to fall into one of these two categories. First, there is the positive coverage, which one could say celebratory coverage of China as leading investor in Africa, especially through grand infrastructure projects, and especially as contrasted with our former colonial masters. The second category is critical coverage that sees China as no more than an emerging global power seeking to expand its influence by posing as a friend of Africa and by taking advantage of the continent's many development predicaments. Well, as an editor of a radical magazine published by Fahamu Africa, which is an organization whose three core values are feminism, Pan-Africanism, and people-centeredness, I guess you will have no problem understanding that my thinking aligns itself to the second position, that is, a critical and cautious stance on China's growing presence on our continent. I would be happier if the media in Africa celebrated China's growing presence and influence less and properly interrogated the real intentions of the Asian giant and explored ways in which more beneficial relations can be built. I have several reasons for taking this view. Number one, China supports in Africa a development discourse that is problematic. That is unlikely to lead to the realization of the aspirations of the African people. Development, as I understand it, is not merely about infrastructure that mainly enables the rich minority to do business. Access to food, healthcare, education, decent housing, basically ending poverty that afflicts the majority of our people, are issues that I do not seem to find China to be interested in. Secondly, and closely related to the above, is the troubling idea of foreign investment as a driver of development. There is nothing wrong with FDI per se, but quite often, foreign direct investment tends to benefit the investors through destructive, extractive activities and not the local people. There are many examples of this in Africa. Poor labor practices have been reported in Chinese farms, in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Zambia, and other countries. Africa loses billions of dollars each year through tax evasion by foreign firms. And African journalists need to investigate and find out whether some of the Chinese firms are involved in this kind of malpractices. Africa's underdevelopment arises mainly from the continent's integration into the world capitalist system. Neocolonial trade relations in which African nations mainly supply cheap raw materials, and we are the market for far more expensive manufactured goods. There is no evidence that China supports an alternative model of development for Africa. I'm not aware of how China uses its international stature as an emerging world power to push for a people-centered world order or to support Africa's meaningful presence on the global stage, in global institutions where policies on Africa are crafted with mostly token participation of Africa itself. Africa is now a big market for Chinese products. And one of the implications of this is the weakening of the local manufacturing sectors. We import very basic things from China, which will be produced locally. Point number 5 is elsewhere in the world, a key problem of Africa's underdevelopment is unacceptable levels of inequality. I guess we all know about the reports that say 85 extremely rich individuals in the world own wealth that is equal to what is owned by some 3.5 billion people. Now, I'm not aware how China's cooperation with African states approaches this question of justice. Many African countries are getting loans from China, and this increases the continent's indebtedness and dependence on China. Africa, we know, is a rich continent, but in reality, probably does not need anyone's loans. A lot of Africa's resources are wasted through corruption by local elites, usually working in cahoots with foreigners. In Kenya, we know that up to a third of the national budget goes into the pockets of powerful individuals. Some allegations have been made about irregular tendering with Chinese firms as well. And while China says it supports Africa's development, I wonder how China engages with Africa in terms of this big issue of corruption. We know that development is not just about economic growth. It's all-encompassing. It is very problematic that China is comfortable doing business with some of the worst repressive governments on this continent. And this is a real issue of development. Another point that I would want us to consider is that Thomas Noel Isidore Sankara, the president of Burkina Faso, told us that the African Revolution is incomplete without the emancipation of women. Other than the few African women who go to China to buy goods to sell in African towns, I would like to find out how China supports the emancipation of Africa's women. Finally, we at Fahamu are a movement-building organization. We believe that Africa's total emancipation is the work of its own people, through not just production, but their politically conscious struggles against oppression, holding governments to account, demanding a better treatment of African people, and so on. So then, does China support Africa's civil society? What sort of projects can China engage in with Africans in order to be more active citizens in holding their countries and their governments to account, and in making sure that the resources that are in Africa benefit the African people? I think these are some of the important issues that media and African people themselves should engage in examining China's Africa relations with the objective of building true solidarity. Thank you.
So that's quite an interesting presentation perspective. I almost thought that perhaps we should pause here and invite questions. That perhaps will be jumping the gun. So we'll reserve your comments and the questions for Henry. He has said some very interesting things. But for now, I think we want to welcome Mr. Liang, Deputy Managing Editor of CCTV Africa. Welcome, and the stage is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, my fellow media colleagues. It's my honor to speak at this panel on behalf of China Central Television substation in Africa. CCTV is China's national TV broadcaster. It chose the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, as the location of its first regional broadcasting hub outside China. It's been an exciting and momentous 4 years and a half since CCTV launched our African programs here in Nairobi. CCTV Africa is currently broadcasting live for 2.5 hours every day through CCTV English News Channel. Our program holds a prime time slot across Africa and also is televised worldwide. Our main show is the general news program called Africa Live. Across the week, CCTV Africa's program also include Talk Africa and analytic analytical show on current and contemporary African affairs. Others are Faces of Africa, which airs documentaries of African people, either prominent or ordinary, who have great stories to tell about Africa. Global Business Africa, a segment that keeps our viewers abreast with the continent's economic landscape. And Matchpoint, an in-depth show that showcases African sports talents. Since its launch, CCTV Africa has presented a new image of the continent to break with the trend in which Africa is often shown in the international media as the continent of endless calamities. As you may already know that coverage largely focused on political unrest, conflict, poverty, drought, ravaging diseases such as AIDS, and more recently the Ebola virus. I worked in CCTV for something like 17 years in the report of international news. Believe me, that's all we got when we try to cover African news. All we got is from Reuters and AP, and that's what we have. What we had exactly 5 years ago. I told my mother I was going to work in Africa for a couple of years. She thought I was crazy. Yeah. So now a quick look at statistics may shed light on why portraying Africa as drive-torn and backward is both unfair and inaccurate. In 2015, Sub-Saharan Africa's GDP grew at 4.5%, making it the fastest growing economic zone in the world, outpacing Asia's regional average of 4.3% annual growth. Equally, Africa is the youngest region in the world, and by 2040 is expected to have the largest workforce in the world at 1.1 billion people. Domestically, Africa itself will be one of the biggest markets in the world. According to McKinsey, Africa's combined gross domestic product will be $2.6 trillion by 2020. By the same year, its own consumer spending by the 128 million households with discretionary income is expected to be around $1.4 trillion. And the number of armed conflicts in Africa has steadily declined from at least 30 at the end of the Cold War to a little under a dozen. Coups have become both odd and fewer. These statistics justify the Africa Rising narrative, which has been at the core of CCTV Africa's reporting of the continent. Now, model reporting CCTV Africa is deploying in its coverage of African affairs is one that encompasses a message of hope. CCTV Africa's approach allows Africans to tell their own stories. It has also provided a platform for African people and their leaders to speak about their lives, dreams, and aspirations. Through its focus on positive attributes in Africa and what is being done to address the continent's challenges, CCTV Africa is among those key voices helping Africans dispel the misplaced notion that the cradle of mankind is a dark continent. We are not turning a blind eye to the negative stories. Make no mistake about it, we do cover Africa's conflicts. We are also on hand to bring out to our audiences when events such as drought, disease, and terrorist attacks occur. We covered bombings in Somalia, but we also covered economic development, foreign investment, boat fairs, soccer matches, various aspects of people's livelihood in the war-torn country. We covered good stories of human interest, not only in Africa Live programs, also in our business and sports reports, in our Talk Africa shows, and our Faces of Africa features. We aim to stay neutral and objective in our reports. We're not here to help demonize a leader or a regime. You know, it's easy to pursue an interview from one side of the conflicts and ignore the other. We do not come all the way to Africa to do an easy job. We do not take sides. We try our best to make the voices of all sides heard. Like in South Sudan's internal conflicts, we talked to both President Salva Kiir and his rival Riek Machar. On Ethiopia and Eritrea conflicts, we not only speak to officials in Addis Ababa, we also invite the Eritrean ambassador to our studio. For many viewers, CCTV Africa is becoming a one-stop shop for news about Africa. This is because we draw from a pool of exciting, innovative, and very talented reporters and cameramen. Our newsroom is a multicultural setup. It's a melting pot. At CCTV Africa, we seek to create an enabling environment for our reporters to explore, develop, and realize their full journalism potential. For our few reporters, it's been a roller coaster journey that has literally taken them across the African continent. They have covered a wide range of issues, some quite cross-cutting, like politics and elections, including how these impact economic growth. They have also found themselves reporting on conflicts in troubled regions, such as Libya, Somalia, DRC, Central African Republic, Mali, South Sudan, and Burundi. In these occasions, they do get sporty sometimes and even risk their lives in the line of duty. CCTV Africa has constantly provided our staff with training on surviving hostile environment, which have helped them get through quite some fluid situation. In terms of scope, CCTV Africa now covers every corner of the continent. In parts of Africa where we do not have correspondents, we have the ability to quickly and effectively deploy reporters and cameramen from Nairobi to cover the breaking stories. Many diplomats we met across Africa say CCTV Africa is setting a new standard for reporting stories from Africa. They generally feel that CCTV has given Africa a much greater voice than any other news channel, which is a great difference. Now, 4 years down the line, CCTV Africa has become a well-established and well-respected international news organization. Our program have achieved remarkable growth in its viewership, making us become one of the most watched international news programs across the African continent and beyond. Now we are looking to expand our news programs to 3 hours a day in the very near future. CCTV is just one of 4 Chinese media organizations which set up regional headquarters here in Nairobi. The others are Xinhua News Agency, China Radio International, and China Daily. I cannot speak for my colleagues from the other 3 organizations, but I know we are all doing an equally important and effective job in presenting the true image of Africa to the world. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mr. Liao. So now we have an open session. Pose your questions, identify yourself, and identify the question. I mean the person to whom you are presenting your question. I can see, we'll take 3 questions at a time.
Thanks. I'd like to respectfully disagree partially with Winslow's argument about the US and UK media. Some of you may have read the very important article that was published around 2009, I think, by Emmah Maudsley, the political geographer at Oxford University, or Cambridge. Anyway, she, in this article, examined the 5 leading British broadsheet newspapers for their coverage of the Chinese presence in Africa and extracted from hundreds of articles themes which were about different aspects of the Chinese presence. All of these themes were extremely negative, very hostile, and her conclusions were, of course, only applicable to those particular media that she examined. But we also tried to do something similar, that is to replicate her study, and studied North American leading newspapers plus CNN. So these were both US and Canadian news media. And virtually every one of the themes found by Emmah Maudsley with regard to British media, we found with regard to North American media over a 5-year period, again examining hundreds of newspaper articles that had appeared in these media, which lead us to the conclusion, it's a limited conclusion, that as to these kind of media, these very well-established, very dominant, very traditional media in North America, these approaches still very much prevail. Now, when I said I would partially disagree with you, I think that with regard to independent online media, there may now be some difference. And I was wondering whether you perceive any degree of difference between the different kinds of media that exists in countries such as the United States and UK in this regard.
Thanks. I think there's another hand here.
Okay, my name is Temani Gunda from Malawi Broadcasting Corporation. I have two brief questions for the editor of Pambazuka. The first question is on the issue of giving loans or aid to African countries. To begin with, I really agree with you that this is one of the issues that has been criticized for contributing to making Africa remain generally underdeveloped. But from your presentation, maybe I missed it. How would you advise China to handle this issue in terms of what's the alternative way of helping Africa if we are to ignore the issue of loans or giving economic aid as such? The second question is just for curiosity's sake, what's the meaning of Pambazuka? Thank you.
And I would like to note that Temani is a former college mate at Communication University of China, and our professor is right here, so very interesting meeting.
Tom Wolf from Ipsos, also was from Pambazuka. I wondered if you, your publication, I look at it now and then, but I haven't done any sort of content analysis. How many stories you've done in the last year or so on the kinds of issues we're talking about, the impact of Chinese loans in infrastructure, or indeed the increasing presence of Chinese companies and individuals, especially on the Kenyan economy. And while you're thinking about the answer, let me just remind you, in case you missed, when we released the fourth section of results from our June national survey, when we asked the question, outside of Eastern Africa, which foreign country do you think it is most important for Kenya to have good relations with? The two highest mentions were the USA and China. Basically, 1/4 of Kenyans has named them both. And when we asked the next question, outside of Eastern Africa, which country do you think constitutes the biggest threat to Kenya's economic and political development? Again, China and the USA were mentioned way more than any other countries. And we got reasons for both of those. And finally, just a little story. 10 years ago, I was having trouble getting my work permit renewed, and it was rejected. I had to go and see the permanent secretary at immigration to find out how to launch an appeal. And because when they reject these work permit applications, they don't give you a reason. So I asked him for the reason, and he said, we have too many foreigners in our economy. And a purpose of our government, this was the Grand Coalition government, was to increase employment opportunities for Kenyans. So I asked him, how many other Kenyans are doing what I do in political public survey research? How many jobs am I taking? He couldn't answer me. And then a couple of days later, the same week, I was walking down Biashara Street to get some curtains, some kitenge curtains, and I went to one shop, and I saw a Chinese fellow with a pair of scissors. Now, I'm not an expert on Asia, so he might have been, Korean, it's possible. Let me not do. And then I walked down and I found an African woman in the next shop on Biashara Street, and I said I wanted some curtains and so on. I said, by the way, and I was asking her in Swahili, I said, who is your neighbor here? She said, oh, he's from China. And I said, well, what is he doing? And she said, and I'm summarizing, she said, it's bad enough now that all the textile industries in Kenya have been killed, and we have to go and buy our fabric out in the Embakazi industrial area that comes in from China and other Eastern countries. But now, she said, if you walk to the end of the block, you'll find 3 other Chinese running shops now that they bought on Biashara Street selling retail, competing with us. 1 week later, to finish the story, we had the opening of Parliament for the session, and I ran into a friend of mine, the late Minister for Immigration, Otieno Kajwang. And I asked him, I said, I've been having trouble getting my work permit renewed, and yet I find on Biashara Street there are at least 3 people from China who are competing with Kenyans selling retail cloth. Why are you giving out those work permits to those people and I'm having trouble? And he said, well, good luck with your appeal, but I can tell you, when President Kibaki a couple of months ago went to Beijing, he dished out to Ambassador Julius Mpuli in Beijing 60,000 work permits to be given out to Chinese there without telling us in the ministry. And we only found out about it through somebody else in the embassies there. So they were basically not controlling entrance into the Kenyan economy because of other types of political arrangements that are being made. So again, these are interesting stories. I wouldn't want you to quote me in your next issue, because I'm still renewing my work permit. But I'm just wondering whether, on both the positive and the negative sides, you can't bring out some of the issues that you are raising in a way that would reach your Kenyan audience a little more effectively. Thank you.
All right, I think the questions are essentially to Winslow and Henry. Respond, then we'll go another round.
All right. Brother Solomon, thank you so much for the very merciful question. I was expecting a little more thunder in there. All right, really quickly. I think your premise is more or less right. I will say that in my professional experience over the past 3 years, American media outlets have gotten better in terms of reporting China-Africa stories. I see the quality improve. How do I judge the quality? Simple. Do they talk to the right people? Who are the right people? People on the ground, or you guys? And if I see a scholar whose name I know, or whose work I've read, mentioned, I think ultimately the article is well researched, or if they're on the ground talking to people who they should be talking to. Now, is it universal? No. I have seen a steady improvement. Is there a difference between those sorts of outlets and more independent outlets, digital startups? Yes and no. A lot of the digital startups do get people with a different kind of background who might have more China experience or more Africa experience, or the countries of Africa. It's not a country, obviously, and who I feel are very solid reporters. But I'm going to add to this really quickly. After this meeting, I would like to take a bet with you. Let's go on Google, and let's Google the last a week's worth of China-Africa stories on news sites. And we're going to look at all the American outlets. And you and I, together, will figure out which ones are unfair or not. And the winner buys the winner will get an alcoholic beverage of their choice.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a few questions here that I would like to respond to. I start with the questions that were raised by my brother from Malawi. I will start with the easiest, which is the meaning of Pambazuka. Pambazuka is a Swahili word, which means the dawn, or daybreak, or awakening. That's the bigger meaning. That's clear. And then, what other ways can China collaborate with Africa beyond or minus the issue of aid or loans? I have attempted to raise some questions about this one. That, for example, direct support for civil society. I don't know what kind of support exists, or what sort of collaboration can exist and be developed with civil societies in Africa, civil society organizations in Africa, that champion justice, that champion human rights, and so on. The questions of loans it's a serious question in the sense that we are getting deeply in that. Even the reports from the World Bank and IMF studies that show that these loans are pushing Africa further into debt, and your children and their children will continue paying these debts for a long, long time. I think it should be possible for researchers on Africa, China-Africa relations to examine which ways in which sustainable or meaningful support can be offered without increasing Africa's indebtedness. Dr. Tom Wood is asking me how many articles on Chinese presence in Africa we have done in the last couple of years. I can understand where he's coming from. He is very interested in numbers. And at this point, as a pollster, is of course quite interested in numbers. At this point, I'm not able to give you an exact answer of how many articles, but if you go to our article, our website, you sure will be able to see that there has been a